I don't even know where to start. I'm James, 39, and until recently, I thought I was living the life I'd always dreamed of, a devoted husband to my wife, Julia, and a proud father to our 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Aaron, 9. For years, I poured everything into my family. I thought we had a solid marriage, built on trust and love. But that illusion came crashing down a month ago when I hired a private investigator to clear up some nagging doubts about Julia's frequent absences and late-night work emergencies. What he found shattered me. My wife has been having an affair. Not just any affair, it's been going on for over a decade. 10 years. And the man? Adam Hawkins, her former boss. Yeah, let that sink in. The PI handed me a thick envelope of evidence. Photos, videos, receipts. I almost threw up right there in his office. Some of the photos were time-stamped from the week Emma was born. I stared at them, trying to make sense of how someone I loved so deeply could betray me like this. Julia's been lying to me for years, and the timing of her absences now feels sinister. There were moments I chalked up to her being busy, trips when she said she was at conferences, the weekends she claimed to be helping her sister. All lies. Adam's name never came up in all these years, though I remember him vaguely from a company Christmas party long ago. I didn't think twice about the way she seemed to light up when he entered the room. I trusted her. But this? It cuts so deep I can't even breathe properly. I've spent the past week trying to wrap my head around this mess while pretending everything's normal for the kids. Aaron's been acting out recently, and Emma, bless her optimistic little heart, keeps asking why mommy seems so sad lately. I can't bring myself to tell them yet. How do you explain something like this to your children? Anyway, that's where I'm at. The PI's report confirmed every fear I'd been trying to suppress. I've already contacted a lawyer and am filing for divorce. I'm also going to fight for full custody because, as much as it hurts, I don't think Julia's capable of putting the kids first anymore. She's too wrapped up in whatever fantasy she's been living with Adam. I guess I'll leave it there for now. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground is crumbling beneath me. So, after I got the report, I knew I had to confront Julia. There was no way around it, even though every part of me wanted to bury my head in the sand. I waited until after the kids were asleep. I didn't want them anywhere near this. When I finally said, "We need to talk," I could see it hit her. She went pale, like she already knew something was up. But I wasn't wasting time. I laid everything out, the photos, the videos, the receipts. The moment she saw the evidence, her face dropped. She didn't even try to deny it at first, but she started with the weak excuses. "James, I know this looks bad, but it's not what you think." I couldn't believe she said that. She was looking at the proof and still trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. "It's not what I think," I asked, barely holding it together. "You've been sleeping with Adam for years. This isn't just some mistake. You lied to me, to our kids." She went quiet for a second, then said, "I was unhappy. I didn't feel appreciated. I didn't mean for it to happen." I just stared at her, trying to process how selfish she could be. I'd given everything to this marriage, my time, my energy, my trust. And this was how she repaid me? She kept begging, saying we could fix things, that she'd cut Adam out of her life. But I wasn't hearing it. I told her flat out, "I can't trust you anymore, Julia. I can't even look at you the same way." That's when she started crying, and I felt nothing. She begged for another chance, but it was too late. The trust was gone. The next day, I filed for divorce. Julia was shocked at how fast everything was moving. She thought I'd beg her to stay, but I wasn't about to do that. Not after everything. Telling the kids was the hardest part. "Emma," she cried. She's always been the hopeful one, always wanting everything to be okay. Aaron, on the other hand, was angry. He barely even looked at her anymore. "I'm just trying to keep things as normal as I can for them. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm doing everything I can to protect them. I have to stay strong for their sake. But man, it's hard." I thought the worst part was going to be the confrontation, but I was wrong. Once the papers were filed, everything hit a new level of chaos. Julia was furious. I mean, livid. It's like she couldn't believe I was actually serious about this. She kept calling me, texting me, trying to guilt-trip me into taking her back. Every time I ignored her, the messages got more desperate. "James, please. I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Don't do this. Please, think about the kids. Are you really going to throw away everything we had for one mistake? Each message felt like a punch to the gut. One mistake. One mistake. This was a decade of lies, deceit, and betrayal. A mistake doesn't last 10 years. A mistake isn't having a second life with someone else behind your husband's back. But she still tried to frame it like I was overreacting. Like I was the crazy one. The worst part is that the kids started getting caught in the crossfire. Emma, being the sweet, naive girl she is, kept asking me why mommy wasn't coming home. Why we were always fighting. She even said she wanted us to fix it, like one of those happy family movies where everything magically gets better. I couldn't give her that. I couldn't lie to her. And then there's Aaron. He's been a mess. He's been acting out at school, getting into trouble, snapping at me, refusing to talk about it. It's like he's holding everything inside. When he's with Julia, it's like he's shut her out completely. He won't even look at her. I think he's angry at her, but he doesn't know how to process it. I've been trying to keep everything together, trying to give them some sense of stability, but I'm starting to lose it myself. Some days, I just want to collapse and scream. This whole situation is eating me alive. And no matter how much I try to shield them from it, I can see how much it's affecting them. They know something's wrong. They just don't know what yet. The legal stuff is another nightmare. Julia hired this high-powered lawyer who's trying to make the divorce as ugly as possible. They're fighting for custody of the kids, claiming I'm just doing this out of spite or trying to punish her. I just want to protect them, but it's like she's spinning this whole narrative that I'm the bad guy. I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. It's only been a couple of weeks since everything blew up, and already it feels like a lifetime. Julia's making everything harder, but the worst part is watching how it's tearing my kids apart. I just want them to be okay. I don't care about anything else, but I don't know how to fix this. As the divorce proceedings continued, Julia's behavior got worse. I thought she'd come to terms with what happened, but instead, she seemed to spiral. Her whole attitude shifted from guilt to defiance. She started telling anyone who would listen that I was the one who'd broken the family, that I was being unreasonable by not forgiving her. She even reached out to some of our mutual friends, trying to turn them against me, painting herself as the victim. Meanwhile, her interactions with the kids were increasingly awkward. Emma kept clinging to her, asking if they could have their old life back, but Julia was distant. Cold, even. She tried to be the fun mom, taking Emma on outings and buying her gifts, but it felt fake, like she was trying to win her over rather than truly reconnect. Emma would come back from those trips with a hopeful look on her face, only for Julia to disappear again, as if she were running away from her responsibilities. Aaron, though, was a different story. He stopped asking about her, stopped acknowledging her when she called. He didn't even want to talk about her at all. Whenever she tried to reach out to him, he'd ignore her, or worse, he'd say, "I don't care." I knew he was hurting, but I didn't know how to fix it. He wouldn't let me in. The final straw came when Julia attempted to overdose. She didn't leave a note, but I knew what it was: her guilt, her shame, her collapse under everything she'd done. My lawyer called me that morning and told me Julia was in the hospital, and that the doctors said it was likely an intentional overdose. Apparently, Adam hadn't even been around when it happened. I'll be honest, I was furious, but more than anything I was terrified. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. I'd spent over a decade supporting her, building a life with her, and now she was throwing it all away. I felt a knot in my stomach. Was she really that broken inside? When I went to see her at the hospital, she was a mess. Her eyes were red, and she looked so much smaller than I remembered, vulnerable in a way that wasn't just sad, but almost pitiful. She didn't say much, just apologized again, over and over. But I didn't know if I could believe her anymore. I wanted to be angry, to shout at her, but instead, I just felt exhausted. The whole situation felt like it was draining me. She wasn't the woman I'd married. And I wasn't sure if I even cared to know who she was anymore. I told her I was filing for full custody of the kids. I couldn't risk them being in her care if she was in such a fragile state. I couldn't let her pull them into her mess. She didn't argue. She just nodded, like she already knew it was over. And maybe, in some sick way, that was the hardest part. Seeing her accept it without a fight. I didn't know what was going to happen next. Julia was in therapy now, trying to get help, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I had to focus on my kids, on keeping them safe, and keeping myself from losing my mind in all of this. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her. Right now, it doesn't even feel like I have the energy to. But I have to keep going. For Emma and Aaron. I have to keep going, no matter what. As if things weren't complicated enough, I decided to take things one step further. I spoke to my lawyer and made the decision to file a lawsuit against Adam Hawkins for emotional distress. I know it's not something people typically do in these situations, but this guy, this scumbag, had destroyed my family, and I wasn't just going to let him walk away scot-free. I remember when I told Julia about it. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, looking pale as usual. She'd been trying to maintain this fragile co-parenting act, where she'd show up, try to spend time with the kids, but you could tell she was barely hanging on. I was sitting there, my hands clenched tight in my lap, and I just said it. I'm suing Adam. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't look shocked, she didn't try to talk me out of it. She just sat there for a long time, staring at the floor. Then, almost quietly, she said, "He didn't mean for it to happen, James. He didn't force me into anything." I swear, hearing that made my blood boil. She still couldn't see what was wrong with what she'd done. She still didn't get that it wasn't just about her and Adam anymore. It was about us, our marriage, our kids, everything we built together. But I couldn't dwell on that. I was too angry, too hurt. And Adam was just as guilty. He'd manipulated Julia for years, pulled her deeper and deeper into whatever sick little world he created for her. My lawyer filed the paperwork, and the lawsuit was official. The emotional distress claim wasn't just about the affair, but about everything it had cost me, my trust, my family, my peace of mind. I wanted Adam to feel the weight of what he'd done, even if nothing would bring my marriage back. Even if nothing would undo the damage to my kids. The next few weeks were a blur. Julia still wasn't doing well. She'd started therapy, but it seemed more like a last-ditch effort than a genuine attempt at healing. She'd been to see a psychiatrist after her overdose attempt, and they diagnosed her with severe anxiety and depression. Honestly, I felt bad for her on some level. I knew the guilt was eating her alive, but at the same time, I couldn't let it sway me. I couldn't let her off the hook. Not when my kids were hurting. Emma tried to call Julia every day, but the conversations were getting awkward. Julia would promise she'd be better, that they could spend time together soon, but Emma always came back disappointed. She's starting to understand more than I'd like, asking questions like, "Why doesn't Mommy love us enough to come home?" Or "Does Mommy love Adam more than us?" It breaks me every time. Aaron, though? He barely spoke to Julia at all. Whenever she'd try to reach out, he'd shut her down. I think he blames her, and honestly, I don't know how to help him process that. He's been so closed off, so angry. I try to talk to him, but it's like I'm talking to a brick wall. The lawsuit against Adam was moving forward, but the whole process felt like one giant weight on my shoulders. There were days I didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to face the courtroom, the meetings with my lawyer, or even the thought of seeing Adam in person. But I had to keep going. For Emma, for Aaron, for me. I couldn't let this go without making sure Adam understood the pain he'd caused. And still, despite everything, Julia keeps trying. She keeps texting, keeps calling, keeps showing up at the house to talk. She even told me once, "Maybe when this is all over, we can work it out." I just looked at her. How could she think that? How could she think I'd ever want to go back to that? After everything? I don't know how I'm supposed to forgive her, or even if I want to. But I do know one thing for sure, I'll never go back to the way things were before. Not for her. Not for Adam. Never again. The days are starting to blur together, but I'm keeping my head above water, for the kids mostly. The court battle for custody has been brutal. Every time I think things might calm down, something else gets thrown in my face. Julia's lawyer keeps dragging out the process, making accusations that I'm alienating her from the kids, as if she's the one they're avoiding. I can see how torn Emma is. She keeps asking me if I'm mad at Mommy, why she's not here, why things feel so broken. And honestly, it's hard to explain. She's too young to understand the weight of what's happened, but she's starting to piece it together in her own way. She'll cling to me after she talks to Julia on the phone, like she's searching for some kind of reassurance that things will be okay. Aaron, on the other hand, won't even pretend. He doesn't want to talk to her. Every time I bring up the idea of him visiting her or talking to her, he shuts down. It's heartbreaking to see my little boy so angry, but I can't blame him. He doesn't trust her, and I don't think I do either. In court, Julia's lawyer tried to paint me as the villain, claiming that I was the one driving the wedge between her and the kids. As if I could control Aaron's anger or Emma's confusion. They tried to twist everything, like I was some kind of monster for making sure she got the help she needed, but also protecting my kids from further hurt. I just kept my cool. I had to. I couldn't let them see me lose it. Julia's mental health was brought up a lot too. I know she's struggling, but it's hard for me to feel any sympathy. Yes, she needs help. But it doesn't change what she did, and it doesn't excuse her behavior. At some point during the proceedings, I just stopped caring about what Julia wanted. It wasn't about her anymore, it was about the kids. About keeping them safe, about trying to rebuild their sense of normalcy, even if it felt like everything was crumbling around us. I filed for full custody because I honestly believe that right now, I'm the stable one. I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who's showing up, no matter how much I'm falling apart inside. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way. Even if it means fighting this fight until the end. Julia still calls me sometimes, trying to get me to drop the custody battle, but I'm not budging. I've seen her attempt to patch things up, but it feels like a show. She's not ready. She's not stable enough to be a consistent presence in their lives. The court hearings keep dragging on, but I know one thing, I'm not backing down. I have to protect them, because they deserve better than this. I wish I could say that things got easier, but honestly, they didn't. The more I fought for custody, the more I realized how deep the damage went. Every day felt like a tug-of-war between keeping my kids grounded and dealing with the weight of everything else. But I kept pushing forward. For them. One evening, after a particularly brutal court hearing, Emma came up to me, holding a drawing she'd done in school. It was a picture of our family, me, her, Aaron, and Julia. But there was a big, jagged line down the middle of the page, separating me from her. She asked me, "Daddy, is Mommy ever coming back home?" It hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had no good answer. How do you tell a child that everything she knew is gone? That her mother, the woman she loved and trusted, had shattered their world? I didn't lie to her. I just told her, right now, Mommy needs some time to get better. I don't know when or if things will go back to the way they were. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. It felt like I was breaking her heart all over again. But I had to be honest with her. I couldn't give her false hope. Aaron didn't ask about Julia much anymore. He barely talked to her. Every time she reached out, he'd roll his eyes or walk away. I couldn't force him to feel anything he wasn't ready to feel, so I just tried to be there for him. Let him vent when he needed to, or let him be quiet when he needed space. It wasn't easy. Some days, I wanted to scream at Julia for what she'd done to us. For putting the kids through all this pain. But I had to focus on what was in front of me, making sure they felt loved and safe, and that they knew I was going to protect them no matter what. In the middle of all this, I got a call from Greta. We'd met on a family vacation a few months earlier, and I didn't expect much from it at first. She was a single mom too, just trying to get by. But we clicked. We didn't rush things, but we stayed in touch, and over time, she became a source of calm in the chaos. Talking to her was like a breath of fresh air after months of drowning. She'd been through her own heartbreak, but she never pushed me to open up too soon. She just listened. She understood. And that connection, it made me feel like I wasn't alone in this world. One night, after the kids were in bed, I found myself texting her, saying how much I appreciated her support. I wasn't ready to jump into anything serious, but I also wasn't ready to shut her out either. She texted back right away, "I'm here for you, James. Whenever you're ready." I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like there might be something worth looking forward to. As the weeks went on, things with Greta started to shift. It was slow, easy. We were both dealing with our own baggage, but there was no pressure. She wasn't trying to fix me, and I wasn't trying to rush into anything. But there was something comforting about having someone in my corner who actually cared. And yeah, maybe there was something more between us, but it wasn't about replacing Julia or forgetting what I had before. It was about starting fresh. Greta would check in on me after every court hearing. I remember one night, after a particularly grueling day where Julia's lawyer had thrown everything they had at me, I sat on the couch, staring at the wall. Aaron was in his room, playing his video games, and Emma was drawing another picture of our broken family. I didn't have the energy to even move. Greta called. She didn't say much at first, just asked how I was holding up. It was one of those rare moments where I actually let myself talk about everything. About the kids, about the divorce, about how hard it was to keep it together. And she just listened. That's all. No advice, no everything's going to be fine, just listening. After I hung up, I felt like I could breathe again. Like for once, I wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. But as good as it felt, the guilt crept in. I wasn't ready to introduce the kids to her yet, but there was a part of me that felt like I was betraying them. They were still so fragile, still caught in the middle of the mess with Julia, and I didn't want to add to the confusion. I had to focus on them, on making sure they felt stable and loved. It was around this time that Julia started making more of an effort, way too much of an effort. She'd been in therapy for a few months now, but I wasn't sure how much progress she was really making. She'd send me texts about how sorry she was, how she was working on herself, but there was always this underlying tone of guilt and manipulation. She wanted to come to the house, to see the kids more. She even asked if we could go to family therapy, like we could somehow pretend everything was fine and fix things in one session. I couldn't even entertain the idea. Not after everything. The kids weren't ready for that, and honestly, I wasn't either. I wasn't sure what Julia was really expecting, whether she was looking for my forgiveness or just trying to clean up her image. Either way, I wasn't biting. That didn't stop her from pushing, though. One night, she showed up unannounced. She just rang the doorbell, stood there like she had every right to be there, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't even look at her. She tried to talk about how she was getting better and wanted to try again, but I shut it down immediately. Julia, we're done. There's no trying again. I'm not doing this for you anymore. It wasn't even about me anymore. It was about the kids. And I was done watching them get hurt by someone who didn't even understand the gravity of what she'd done. After that night, things settled down a little. Julia's attempts to get back into the kids' lives became less frequent, but there was still tension. Every conversation with her felt like walking on eggshells. Emma still held on to hope that one day we'd all be a family again, but I couldn't give her that. Aaron, well, he didn't want to talk about it. And honestly, I didn't know how to make him. He was angry, and I was too, but I had to keep it together. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. And then there was Greta. I started thinking maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe I could rebuild my life without looking back at the ruins of the past. But part of me still felt like I was walking a fine line, like one wrong move and everything could come crashing down again. The final court hearing came faster than I expected. I'd been in and out of legal meetings for months, but now it was crunch time. The kids had been through enough, and I just wanted it to be over. The constant back and forth, the questions about custody, the accusations, it was all wearing me thin. I had no idea how I'd hold it together through one last round. Julia had been quieter lately. Her lawyer kept making half-hearted claims about her being ready to work on herself, but I could see through it. She wasn't the same person I married. She hadn't been for years. Still, she showed up at the court, sitting with her head down, avoiding eye contact. She wasn't fighting me the way she had before, but I wasn't sure if that was because she was finally accepting the reality or just tired of the battle. I kept my focus on the kids. Aaron's anger still simmered, and Emma's hopeful little heart was still too fragile. But she was starting to realize what I had already known, that some things just couldn't be fixed. The judge took his time, asking questions, listening to everyone's side, but it was clear where things were headed. I didn't expect any miracles. I didn't want them. All I wanted was to make sure that I could offer a stable home for Emma and Aaron, that they'd have the love and safety they deserved, even if that meant cutting Julia out for good. When the judge finally gave the ruling, I wasn't relieved, I was exhausted. The kids would stay with me full-time, with supervised visits for Julia. It was a bittersweet victory. I wasn't thrilled about the outcome, but I was thankful. The kids were safe. I was safe. That night, when I told Emma and Aaron, Emma hugged me, her little arms wrapping around me as tight as she could. Aaron gave a small nod, like he was processing it all. Neither of them smiled, but I could see a weight had been lifted off their shoulders, even if they didn't fully understand the depth of it. Julia tried to call me afterward, demanding to know why I took everything from her, but I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses anymore. I had to do what was best for my family. In the days that followed, I spent more time with the kids, just the three of us. I could feel the tension easing between us, and even Aaron was starting to let his guard down a little. We started finding new routines, things that felt normal again. I even took them to the park one Saturday, just like we used to. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe we could rebuild. But the scar from everything that had happened would stay. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive Julia, but I wasn't focused on that anymore. I had to move forward, for me and for the kids. And maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for something new, something better, down the road. After the court ruling, things slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The kids were adjusting, at least as much as they could. Aaron still had his moments of anger, but he was quieter now, like the storm inside him had calmed a little. Emma, though, kept asking questions. Why can't Mommy just come home? She'd ask at random, when I least expected it. I didn't have a good answer for her, but I tried to reassure her as best as I could. It wasn't easy to see Julia still trying to reach out, still sending texts and occasionally showing up at the house unannounced. It was hard not to feel anything when she'd beg me to just let her see the kids more, or tell me she was getting better. But I had to stay firm. I knew she wasn't ready, and I couldn't risk dragging the kids into her mess again. In the midst of it all, Greta and I kept talking, kept growing closer. She understood what I was going through without asking too many questions. It wasn't like I was rushing into a relationship with her, but it was nice to have someone who wasn't part of the wreckage, someone who actually saw me, not as a broken man or a victim, but as a person. She invited me and the kids to a small get-together with her family one weekend. It wasn't anything big, just a cookout in her backyard, but I was nervous. I hadn't introduced the kids to anyone new in a while, and I wasn't sure how they'd react. But they were fine. Emma even warmed up to Greta's son, a little boy about her age. They played together like they'd known each other forever, and for the first time in a long time, I saw Emma smile, genuinely. Aaron kept to himself, but he didn't seem as resistant as before. I was grateful for that. Maybe he was finally starting to let go of the bitterness, even if only a little at a time. But the best part? I didn't feel like I was pretending anymore. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was just getting by. I could see a path forward. I could see that my life wasn't over, that there was still room for hope. Maybe even for love, down the road. It wasn't going to be easy. Julia would always be their mother. I couldn't change that. But I was determined to make sure my kids felt loved and supported. I had a long way to go in rebuilding my own life, but I wasn't alone anymore. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after the ruling felt like a quiet kind of victory. Things were far from perfect, but they were better. There were no more constant court battles or late-night fights. The chaos had settled, but the emptiness of what Julia had done still lingered. Aaron's anger didn't magically disappear. He still shut down at times, still blamed me and his mom for what had happened. He was trying to process it all, but I knew it wasn't easy. He'd spend hours in his room, headphones on, avoiding everyone. I kept my distance when he needed it, but I also made sure he knew I was there if he ever wanted to talk. Emma was doing better, but it still hurt to watch her pretend things were normal when they weren't. She'd draw pictures of the family, asking me to hang them on the fridge like we used to. She still held out hope that everything would get fixed, that Mommy would come home, that we could be the way we were. I hated crushing her dreams, but I couldn't lie to her either. Then, out of nowhere, Julia reached out again. This time, it wasn't just a text, it was a phone call. I didn't even want to pick up, but I knew I had to. She said she was doing better, that she was working hard to get herself back together. She told me she was in therapy, she was sober, and she wanted to be there for the kids. It all sounded like the same old story, but I listened anyway. After everything, I wasn't sure if I believed her. When I told Emma about it, her face lit up. "Does this mean Mommy's coming home?" she asked, with that hopeful innocence only a child could have. I didn't know how to explain it to her. "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice tight. "It means she's working on getting better, but we're still taking it one day at a time." She seemed to understand, but it didn't stop the quiet sadness in her eyes. Julia did start coming around more though. She would pick the kids up for supervised visits, but even those were awkward. Emma would hug her, but Aaron barely acknowledged her. I didn't know what the right balance was. How much was too much? How much was enough? I kept leaning on Greta. She was still there, patient, supportive. She never pressured me to rush things or get over it, but she made it clear she was willing to be a part of the kids' lives if and when they were ready. The one thing I appreciated most about her was that she understood I couldn't rush healing, couldn't rush trust. She didn't want to be a substitute for Julia, but she was open to building something real, something healthy, when the time was right. For now, though, I was focused on the kids. I was focusing on us, on making sure Aaron didn't lose himself in his anger and that Emma didn't lose herself in fantasy. We were rebuilding, but it wasn't easy. And it wasn't fast. There were days when I doubted I was doing the right thing, when I questioned whether I should have tried harder to make things work with Julia, or whether I was making the right choices for my kids. But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't the same man I was a year ago. I'd been tested in ways I never thought possible, and I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was stronger for it. And for the first time in a long time, I was starting to believe that there could be a future. Not a perfect one, but one that was mine. One that was full of new chances, new people, and the possibility of healing. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The summer passed by faster than I expected. There were still bumps along the way, little things that reminded me how far we had to go. Julia's visits were getting more consistent, but they weren't getting easier. Emma seemed to hope every time she saw her mom that things would magically click back into place, but Aaron was still keeping his distance. And I couldn't blame him. He was still hurt, still angry. I kept a close eye on him. Some days, I'd find him sitting by the window, staring outside like he was looking for something he couldn't find. Other times, he'd burst out with random outbursts of frustration, slamming doors or storming out of the house. As much as I wanted to fix things, I knew I couldn't force him to heal faster than he was ready. But there were good days, too. Days when he'd open up a little, talk about school or his friends. I could see that he was slowly starting to let me back in, and I was grateful for it. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Emma was more straightforward, always wearing her heart on her sleeve. She would bring up the family picture all the time, still wanting us to pose for one together, even though I knew we'd never be that family again. I didn't have the heart to tell her that just yet, so we kept taking those pictures, just the three of us. Greta was becoming more of a constant presence. We'd go out for coffee after the kids went to bed, or take walks while they were at school. She was patient with me, never rushing or pushing for anything more than what I could give. And somehow, through all the mess, she felt like a breath of fresh air. I was starting to look forward to those small moments with her, where I didn't have to think about all the weight I'd been carrying for so long. But even with her, there was a part of me that still felt like I was walking on thin ice. I hadn't yet let go of everything Julia had done to us, and it made me cautious, almost hesitant to give my heart away again. I didn't want to bring someone else into the wreckage of my past, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't just shut myself off forever. Then came one of those random nights that seemed like a turning point, but you didn't realize it until later. The kids and I were sitting on the couch, watching some ridiculous superhero movie, when Emma suddenly asked, "Dad, when is Mommy coming to see us again?" It was a question I was prepared for, but it still stung. I could feel the weight of it in my chest. I took a deep breath, glancing at Aaron, who was pretending not to care. "She's coming this weekend," I said. "But remember, sweetheart, things are different now. We're not going to be a family the way we were. But that's okay, right? We're still a family, even if it's just us right now." Emma nodded, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her in close. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And sometimes, that was all I could give. As I sat there, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not without scars, but I was moving forward. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe it'd be hard, maybe it'd be messy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could take whatever came next. And that felt like enough for now. The next few months went by with more of the same. Julia continued her visits, and while Emma still held out hope, Aaron was growing more distant. He didn't talk to Julia much, just gave her the bare minimum. I didn't push him to open up, I just let him process it in his own way. As for me, the anger that had been bubbling inside me for so long finally started to quiet. Not gone, but quieter. I found myself thinking less about what Julia had done and more about the life I was building with my kids. I wasn't forgiving her, not yet, maybe not ever, but I was learning to live without that constant rage. It felt strange, but I could tell I was becoming someone else, someone who wasn't defined by the betrayal. Greta and I started talking about the future more. I could tell she was patient with me, giving me the space to figure things out, not rushing anything. She had her own history of heartbreak, so she understood. I was still cautious, but I let myself start to imagine what a future with her might look like. One night, after the kids were in bed, I had a moment of clarity. I thought about how far I'd come. It wasn't perfect, and I still had bad days, but I wasn't stuck anymore. I wasn't waiting for Julia to fix everything. I was moving forward, even if it was one small step at a time. The phone call I got the next day from Julia wasn't one I was expecting. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us. I was hesitant at first, but there was something in her voice, something different. Maybe she was finally ready to face the consequences of everything she'd done. I agreed, mostly for closure, for both of us. When we met, there was no drama, no accusations. Just her, looking tired, like she'd aged years in just a few months. She apologized again, but this time, there was a weight behind it. I didn't know if it was genuine, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was ready to move on, with or without her. We sat for a while, neither of us saying much, just letting the silence hang between us. Finally, I spoke. I'm not holding on to the past anymore, Julia. Not for you, not for anyone. I'm moving on. You should too. She nodded. It wasn't a happy moment, but it was one of acceptance. I didn't need to forgive her to be free. That was something I had to do for myself. As I left, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new, one step closer to the life I wanted for my kids, for me, and maybe even for Greta. The months after that meeting with Julia felt like a strange kind of healing, but not in the way I thought it would. There wasn't some grand moment where everything clicked into place, where I could look back and say I was truly over it. I think I'd built up this idea that forgiveness, closure, and healing would come in a neat package deal. But it didn't. Instead, it was a slow, grinding process. It was messy. It was uneven. Some days, I felt like I was making huge strides, and others, it was like I was back at square one. But that's life, isn't it? It's not about this perfect recovery. It's about learning to keep moving, even when the road ahead doesn't look like anything you imagined. Julia was still in the picture, but I started to see her less and less. I think she understood that pushing for a full family reunion was never going to happen. The kids were still confused by her sporadic appearances. Emma still had her hopes up, but Aaron was getting angrier, more withdrawn. There was this simmering resentment, like a pressure cooker about to burst. And I wasn't sure how to get through to him. I talked to Greta about it once, and I could tell she wanted to help, but I couldn't ask her to fix it. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few encouraging words. This was a wound that needed time, distance, and understanding, things that neither Julia nor I could give Aaron right away. At first, I thought that maybe if Aaron had more time with Julia, he'd soften up. But after a few failed attempts to get him to meet with her outside of the supervised visits, I realized that wasn't the answer. He needed space. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table, just the three of us, and Aaron finally spoke up. It was the first time he had actually said anything about what was going on. He looked at me, his eyes full of frustration. "You don't get it, Dad," he said, pushing his food around his plate. "Mom's not coming back. She's not even trying to be a real mom anymore. And now you're just moving on." I sat there, trying to figure out how to respond without making it worse. I knew he wasn't angry at me, not really. He was angry at what had been taken from him, what we had lost. I could see the hurt behind his words, but I had to be careful not to invalidate his feelings. "I know, son," I said, my voice tight. "I know it's hard. But I'm not moving on from you. I'm not moving on from us. I can't keep holding on to something that's gone. It doesn't help you or me, and it definitely doesn't help your mom." He didn't say anything back, but I could see him thinking it over. That was enough for now. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was a start. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to be holding it together, or at least pretending to. She had her moments when she'd ask if we could all live together again. I hated having to explain that it wasn't going to happen, but I did. She was resilient, though. More than I gave her credit for. She'd give me these little half-smiles, like she understood, even though I knew she didn't fully. But she was learning that things couldn't go back to the way they were. The real turning point came one Sunday afternoon, when Greta invited me and the kids over to her place for a casual barbecue. She was there with her son, a couple of her friends, and her sister. I was nervous about how the kids would react, especially Aaron, but I could see he was trying to hold it together. I knew that bringing them into her world wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that it was time for them to see there could be a life after the mess Julia had left behind. It was an awkward start. Aaron stayed distant, as usual. Emma was shy but warmed up quickly to Greta's son. They spent most of the afternoon running around in the yard. I sat with Greta's friends, feeling out of place but somehow comfortable. They didn't ask a lot of questions, didn't try to poke at the past. They were just kind, and that kindness made me feel like I could breathe. As the sun started to set, Greta and I stood on the porch, watching the kids play. It was quiet for a moment, then she turned to me and said, "You're doing the right thing, you know." "I hope so," I replied. I wasn't sure how much I believed that at the time. I still felt like I was stumbling through everything, like I was barely holding on. "You're giving them a chance," she said, her hand lightly resting on my shoulder. "A chance to heal. A chance to have a life without constantly looking back." It hit me then, the weight of it all. She wasn't just talking about the kids. She was talking about me, too. I wasn't going to get the past back, and I wasn't going to fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, I could build something new, something that didn't feel broken. Later that night, as I tucked Emma and Aaron into bed, I noticed a change in them. They seemed a little lighter, a little more at peace. Emma gave me a hug, something she hadn't done in a while, and whispered, "I'm glad we're together, Dad." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me believe that we could get through this, that we were starting to find our way. Julia still called sometimes, trying to check in, trying to connect with the kids. I'd let her talk to Emma for a few minutes, but that was it. I wasn't interested in getting pulled back into the past. The kids were adjusting, and so was I. But the reality was that Julia wasn't coming back. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted her to. I still didn't know what the future held. Maybe things would get messy again, maybe they wouldn't. But I was starting to believe that the future could be better. That despite everything we'd lost, we still had the chance to build something worth having. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Time kept moving forward, and so did we. It wasn't always easy, but there was a sense of calm that I hadn't felt before. The kids were settling into a new routine, even Aaron, who had started to open up more. He wasn't angry all the time anymore, though there were still days when I could see the old hurt creeping back in. But he was trying, and that was enough for now. Emma was growing up fast, too. She'd stopped asking about when Mom would come back. She still loved Julia, but she was starting to understand that things were different. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to explain it to her fully, but I was doing my best. Greta and I had spent more time together, little by little. There was no rush, no pressure. It felt like we were both finding our own rhythm, fitting into each other's lives without trying to force anything. I hadn't let myself feel this way in a long time, like I could hope for something better without carrying around all the weight of my past. One afternoon, after a long day of work, I came home to find Aaron sitting on the couch, his legs pulled up under him, looking at his phone. Emma was running around in the backyard with Greta's son. There was a moment of clarity, a moment where I realized that despite everything, we were okay. Not perfect, but okay. As I watched them play, Greta came outside and stood next to me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "You're doing great," she said, her voice soft. I didn't have the words to reply, but I didn't need them. I just nodded, knowing that she was right. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. I wasn't trapped in the past. I wasn't stuck in the hurt Julia caused. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't easy. But it was ours. And that was enough.